So this is going to be part three of deploying, well, it's the second deployment of deploying a Tika Java jar file as a Docker container on a Linux machine in the Azure, one of the Azure PaaS environments. So this one's going to be Azure Service Fabric on Linux. That's going to be this one right here. And this one also, we're going to use a Docker Compose file as part of this deployment. So this will actually end up getting exposed on port 80 also, like the previous one on Azure App Service. For this one, we're going to do the same setup. We're going to create a resource group. And for this one, we actually need to have the Service Fabric CLI installed. So before we just needed the Azure CLI installed. This one, the Service Fabric team created their own, I don't know why, they created their own CLI, and that is different requirements for installation. So I found that a little frustrating, but it does work. So you can create a cluster. So this one's a lot more sophisticated than like the app service was. You can do some more interesting things here. You can do a variety of different deployment models, and you can also do multi-node. So, which is easy actually here. So we're going to create a cluster, and then we're going to select that cluster, and then we're going to do a Docker Compose basically and create a deployment. So if we look at the scripts for this, I've actually got the same kind of script thing as previously. The first script, the 0 script, is basically to do a login. You only need to run this once every so often, and you'll stay logged in. So you can run the other commands kind of repeatedly while you play with it. The create resource script will actually create a resource group, and then it's going to create a cluster. So this one's a little IaaS-y, but not really. It's really PaaS still because you're just sizing the cluster. You can actually deploy apps or multiple apps into the cluster though. So this is kind of different than the app service one, right? So this is a Service Fabric one. I don't know. It's pretty different actually for that point of view. So we're going to create a cluster, and we're going to decide so you have to do a certificate. So this one's actually got some setup. You got to go through the setup guide because you're going to have to create some certificates, and then tell it what kind of servers you're going to run, and it will configure all those servers for you. So I call this PaaS, but it sort of feels weird. It's kind of like an IaaS thing, I guess, because you're not managing individual ones and you can pick clusters. You can consider it more of a PaaS environment and not IaaS. And then we're going to deploy the app. We're basically going to bind to the endpoint, and then so we set up the a bunch of this stuff in with the Azure CLI. And then when we deploy the app, we actually use the Service Fabric control command line to do this. So we're going to bind to the control point for that cluster, and then we're going to run a compose command to create a deployment. So you can actually put multiple deployments in these clusters. And then when we go to undeploy, we're basically going to select the cluster, and we're going to call the undeploy command. And then we can delete the resources, which is the resource group. So if you want to flip back and forth, you can run 2 and 3, and then 2 and 3, 2 and 3. If you're just going to run this and see if you can make it work, and then tear it all down, you can actually just run 4, delete the resource group, everything will go away, right? Because that's the beauty of the resource groups. Okay, so if we look at this, we're going to go, and we're going to go into Azure Service Fabric. We have the scripts. So we'll do dots or bash Azure 1. We're going to create the resource group, and what else are we going to do? We're going to create the cluster. All right. We're going to pause. Okay, so we created the cluster. That actually took a while, and you can see that part of this talked about what ports are available, starting and end ports, whatever. So we actually created a cluster. We can decide how many nodes we want in it. And now we're going to deploy applications into that. Oh, you know what? Let me look and show you real quick. If we look at the resource groups here, and we go to this resource, not that one. We want to go to this one. You can see that actually, so in the app fabric one, we just created an app group or whatever, and then we deployed the app in it. This one's kind of cool. if you want to get a feel for like kind of how you would do your own deployments, this will give you some idea, right? So there's a bunch of resources in here. They allocated a storage account. They set up a service fabric cluster, which makes sense because that's what we're doing. Created a key vault because we actually needed to have a place to put the keys so that we could then make remote API calls into this. There's a load balancer for this. There's a scaling set so we can pick the size we want the scale to be. There's a public IP and there's a virtual net. So the good news on this one is if you want kind of an example of all the pieces that would go together to make a deployment, that's what this one generates. Look, and we're going to deploy the app. So we're going to do bash Azure to deploy app. So this one's the one that's got to bind to the endpoint. So all the names and the ports have to match up. And we also had to generate certs for this. So I didn't show any of the cert generation process. If you look at the setup guide, it points, or the README MD, it'll point you off at where the instructions are how to set keys. So I had to create some keys because we're going to do a secure endpoint for this, you can see. So keys had to be generated for that. I'm going to pause. All right, so this one actually takes a while and it's confusing. You'll see this binding message. And if your login, like my login just timed out, you'll get a complete crazy set of messages that make it hard to read. I just always assume if I got that, the long red crazy set of messages, that my login expired, and I rerun the 0 script to refresh my credentials because I took too long. So this one did this, and I did kind of an insecure thing. Even though I have certificates, I have certificate validation turned off, and that's because they're self-signed certs. So you can look at the script and see how I did that. And if this really takes a while, like this will complete, but you won't actually have any nodes yet. So you can see here, I actually would go to all resources. Actually, what I'll do instead is I'll do my normal route. Oh, let me go to the resource groups. Let me look for my app. Oh, this is the FSI Tika service fabric cluster. So this one takes a while, and even though you claim to have set this cluster up, it doesn't actually build any of the nodes till you deploy the app. So in this case, by default, I set up 5 nodes. That is actually in this 2 script here. I'm sorry, that's the deploy. We want create. So if we look here, we can see that I set the cluster size to 5. So that thing will say that it's good to go, and then you got to go look in the console and see if you see those 5 nodes. And when you do, you're good. So that means you can actually connect to this dang thing. And so then the only question now is, oh crud, what? Because I cleared the screen. What was the name this was going to be under, right? So let's go look in the console and see if we can figure it out, actually. And nope, well, it's probably, you know what? Let's go back and look, right? It should be here somewhere. Let's look at the public Yelp load balancer. And then the public load balancer says, the public load balancer does not tell me what I need to know. Okay, let's look at the configuration. Nope. We know the IP address, I could go to that. And then we can try properties. Oh, there it is. There's our name right there. So let's go pick this one up and see if we can connect. Right? Because it took a while to go provision all those machines and deploy this thing. And there you go. So you got to be patient on the service fabric one. So that's really it. We saw here that when we went to the resources, that there was this app. And when you do the deployment, it's going to go hydrate and build out 5 machines or however many you said. And you can put multiple applications on those nodes. So once the nodes are up, you can kind of play around with them. So you set up a cluster and then you deploy apps into them. And in my case, because the nodes weren't already up, it had to go take care of all that. So that's really it. I hope you got something out of this. There's a couple scripts to tear this down, but I'm at 10 minutes, and we're not going to show it.